this is kind of a challenging talk because of all the countries in the world, I think the United States and India are the most emotionally attached to the idea of democracy. We Americans believe that we embarked on one of the most important initial experiments with modern democracy and had a reasonable amount of success with it. And Indians, of course, are rightly proud of being the largest democracy in the world. It's something that's continuously repeated. So it turns out that both countries have this deep, so what you might call mythology about democracy. Now, let me make a confession here. I have become much less enamored with American democracy, to the extent that, were I able, I would willingly resign my citizenship and take up citizenship in another country. I'm not as rich as one of the founders of Facebook, which is pushing off to Singapore. He can afford to live wherever he likes. I couldn't do that. And it'd be difficult. He's got so many assets, if he leaves a lot of them behind, it would be a big deal. But American democracy has gone from something that was believable in the 1950s, as being successful, that is, delivering what most people wanted with relatively little burden on the general public, to I think many of the problems that exist in the world have begun with some American foreign policy, certainly in the 1970s. So, whereas in the 1950s, when I grew up, we had just come through World War II, which was a terrible burden on the United States. We felt like we made enormous sacrifices, and indeed we did it, in order to promote the ideas of democracy. And we were rightly, I think, at that point proud of it. And I grew up in that. And I was a little bit blinded by it. And it was something of a god to us. Democracy was just something that we sacrificed for. Okay? So, there's a national mythology, I think, that we all have. But one of the things that happens is, if we develop emotional attachments to it, we overlook the problems with it. And what happened in the United States, and I think in many countries, that have this sort of idea about democracy, this sort of image, is that the trend has been towards unlimited democracy. That is, the democracy has been an instrument for the state to grow with very almost unlimited, or with very few limits. Now, so what happens is that the more we believe in democracy as a sort of ideal, then the more likely we will develop expectations that expanding the democratic process to incorporate more and more aspects of life will make us better off. So it's sort of a logical sequence here. We bow to this ideal, and how could we ever question it? And so what we're coming up with is what I see, as I suggested to you. In the 1950s, most Americans would believe that government is something we should turn to make our lives better. But over time, we've seen this as an excuse to expand the state. Now, what I'm going to talk about here is not that we should return to autocracy or monarchy or imperialism. The suggestion here is really, it's not an all or nothing. It's a more or less question. What I'm going to suggest to you is that we've got too much democracy in our lives. That is, democracy and politics influence our lives too much. And that's sort of the punchline of the story. Now, what I'm going to do is start with kind of an instrumental understanding of democracy. And as an economist, if you'll excuse me, for me, and for all economists, and indeed for all of you, if you think about it, the defining aspect of our existence is something that economists call scarcity. If it were not for scarcity, we wouldn't have to make choices. Our lives are made of choices. If it were not for scarcity, we would live forever. That would change, probably some of us, change our moral standing. So the fact that we live in a world defined by scarcity really defines the human condition. Now, problems arise from scarcity. There's not enough seats in classrooms for every student to get the same level of education. That's a scarcity problem. There's not enough resources for the state to provide water pipes to the slums, whatever it may be. All of these things are defined by scarcity. Or there are not enough Ferraris in the world for me to have one. So, now, how do we respond to scarcity? Well, there's two basic ways. What I will describe as a non-market mechanism and markets and pricing system. Now, the one that I work with the most is the secondary one, but we're all very familiar with the non-market mechanism. So we're trying to solve these problems both individually and collectively. How do we get more education to people? How do we get more water to people? You know, how can I get more of what I want or help you get what you want? Now let's look at these non-market mechanisms first. Now, they come in a couple of flavors. Some of them are social and cultural institutions like civil society in broad terms. Ethnic associations, clubs, whatever sorts of, very often mostly voluntary arrangements. But then, political mechanisms are part of these non-market arrangements. So this, in particular, is what we're going to focus on today. Democracy and the public policies that are associated with democracy. Okay? Now, let's see what happens when we rely upon democracy. What goes on? Well, first of all, if we are a citizen, there is much of it is defined by involuntary association. I'm born into this country. I have a passport. Now, if I want to continue being a citizen, I am forced, whether I want to pay my taxes or not, I'm forced to do many things I'd rather not do. It depends on whether you have military conscription. You may be conscripted in the military. You don't want to serve, but you're forced to do it. So governments impose a great deal of involuntary arrangements on us. Maybe I don't want to sit in class next to a woman who's not covered because that goes against my cultural arrangement. Whatever it may be, governments may force you to do things you may not wish to do. So by definition, governments are an instrument of implicit or explicit force. And that's what distinguishes them from these other non-market arrangements. Clubs you join or unjoin. You're invited to join or not. Now, the other thing is that in democratic, since we're talking about democracy, in democratic settings, it is based upon majority support, or sometimes it's only plurality. But at least it's one of the two. So you have a tax as a funding source. There's taxes that are used as a redistributed instrument. And redistribution is by definition what we call a zero-sum game. If you pay, you lose. Government spends, I gain. There's a zero-sum game. So the problem with that, in my view, is that this invites social conflict. Because why does he get what I have to give up? Why does he get more than I get? Why does that group have a special identity and special privileges? My group doesn't. So I resent them. This creates social conflict. Now, democracy and political arrangements are exclusive. The most obvious point is immigration laws. It'll be virtually impossible for me, not being an NRI, to become an Indian. It's an exclusive thing. Every government defines itself in part by its immigration policy. Now, another element of democracy is that there are periodic contests. Votes only occur every 2 years, 4 years, 5, 6, whatever it may be. Okay? What this means is that the participants who are selected to represent us in the democracy have very weak accountability. It's difficult to punish them if we don't like what it is they're doing or not doing. Governments face very weak budget constraints. Pay more taxes. We just raise taxes. Pay taxes on gold imports. Right? We invent a new tax. A tax that didn't exist before. So governments are less constrained by budgets because of the power to tax. You don't want to pay tax? You go to jail. Or we just take your property. They've got that capacity. So, this weakens their budget constraints. Now, what happens then is the result is that life outcomes are much more heavily influenced by political processes. And what this does is ultimately it robs individuals of a sense of achievement. So, I'm successful. And then I'm punished for my success by paying taxes at what I might call, in France, they want to raise the tax on millionaires at 75%. So I earn, $1 and I give up 75% to the government. Why did I do all that work? Why should I achieve this? And then on the other side, I'm a recipient of the money from the government. Where's my sense of achievement? This is one of the pernicious aspects of what we call welfare, is that able people who receive it are robbed of the human dignity associated with achievement. So we've actually done them a disservice by creating dependency. Now these are able people. I'm not talking about the truly dispossessed and truly unable to do for themselves. So these are some interesting problems here. Now let's compare that with another technique for addressing problems with scarcity. So this is what we do. We rely upon governments to solve certain problems for us. Now, let's look at what the approach to markets might be. Now, markets and pricing system are much different. It's voluntary interaction. You go to this chai wall, you go to that one, or you don't go to any of them. You drink your tea at home. So you can associate or disassociate. Completely voluntary. So it involves non-participation. You don't have to participate in the market at all. Now, in government, it's not voluntary. You have an obligation to participate. Unanimity. In any market transaction, there's always unanimity. If we agree on a price, it means that all parties are in agreement. In a government setting, it's at best majority rule. At best. So, what we find is that market transactions are by definition always positive sum games. That is, both parties are winners. In democratic political transactions, there's always a zero-sum game. If you throw waste and corruption in there, it's a negative-sum game, actually. So, because there's positive-sum games, instead of conflict, this is an opportunity for more social cooperation, more harmony among different people. Because I see you not as someone that can be exploited to give me more things that I want. I see you as someone I have to cooperate with in order to get from you what it is I want. Now, markets are all about open access. Businesses that try to discriminate against people on the basis of height, weight, race, religion, gender, will earn fewer profits. It goes against the very nature of markets to discriminate against your customers. You want all the customers you can get. So the tendency, this doesn't guarantee anything, but the tendency is that markets will undermine at least economic discrimination. Social discrimination, markets can't do much with because that's a cultural phenomenon. But so what I normally say is that markets will undermine discrimination between 9 and 5. You may not want your daughter to marry one, but you'll sell to him or her. So, unlike political arrangements, there's continuous competition, which means that all the participants are accountable. Say, you don't deliver what you promised, I don't do business with you again. Politician doesn't do what he's promised, oops. Got no account. There's no accountability. Strong budget constraints. If you've ever run a business, or if you haven't run a business, you would still presumably understand that businesses can't just raise money out of the air. They can't go out on the street and point a gun at someone and say, come in and buy from me. Or charge me less for my inputs. They've got to find a way to work it out so that they are able to continue their operations. So, life outcomes that are based not on political arrangements, but are based more on merit, on competition and social cooperation, give people a sense of fulfillment, of achievement. And this probably, they've started on these studies of so-called gross national happiness. I think probably the most important element of happiness that I understand, now you may be different, but it's achievement. I think countries where people have a sense of achievement are the people who are the happiest. That is, being able to fulfill something that their neighbors value. If you've ever had that feeling, then you know how important it is. Now let's see what democracy can deliver. Again, we've got our ideal images of democracy, but let's see what... Now, we'll start with kind of a macro concept. First of all, democracy, as Indians embraced it initially, was all about national self-determination. That is, we wanted to get rid of the colonialism. So this was an instrument so that as a people, Indians could decide for their future instead of some colonial despots. Okay? Now, it succeeded. Voila. Now let's look at another element of this. Now this second element focuses on the individual. So we go from a macro perspective to a micro perspective. So individual self-determination, I choose what my life will be as a human being, as opposed to we Indians decide where we're going. Now, so choose our own destiny with self-ownership. I own myself. Slavery is not, I'm not a slave to a man, nor to a government, in principle. And I have property rights that arise from that. So in the pursuit of my life purposes, I acquire property that should be protected just as much as the integrity of my self-ownership should be protected. Just as I should not be dispossessed of my self-ownership, no one, no individual, nor any organization should dispossess me of my property. Now, in a way, there's been a failure in this regard. We look at many of the ex-colonial governments, and what we found is that individual liberty and rights have been sort of set aside. So, what we see then, in many countries, we tend to focus more on something called human rights, or what I might call group rights. So somehow the individual is just pushed aside. And sacrifices must be made for a greater good, something to that effect. But the compensation is not really there. So, this is an interesting problem. We've got democracy delivering only half of its promise in this regard. Because, as we'll see in a moment, as you all know, I think we're all sort of, when we talk about democracy, we talk at once about this ideal, while we still understand that it's just fundamentally a voting rule. It's nothing more or less. Majority rule. That's all it really is. We attach other things to it. Now, I attach, and as many people do, this individual self-determination is a crucial element. Democracy is an instrument, not an end result. So, now, we can look around. Democracy may not deliver prosperity, communal harmony, nor income equality. So we can see lots of countries around the world that call themselves democracies. They're not prosperous. Zimbabwe is a democracy. People's Democratic Republic of North Korea is a democracy. Lots of places are called democracies. India was a democracy for a long time. It wasn't rich, right? Democracy didn't deliver prosperity in India, right? You got independence, you didn't have prosperity. Not for a long time. It doesn't deliver communal harmony. You see in lots of places, you see in the Balkans where people were involved in genocide, even though they had democratic leadership. Communal problem exists here in India. Income equality is not necessarily a result of it either. So, one of the problems is that many political decisions that are meant to promote welfare are actually instrumentally undemocratic and unjust or unfair. Now, this may launch a firestorm of disagreement, but we'll leave that part for later. Granting special rights to any group, regardless of the purpose behind it, is detrimental to the entire fabric of the idea of democracy. So this, in my view, includes reservations. It includes special laws giving special rights to women, any more than giving special rights to tall men or short men. These things have a pernicious effect on the operation of politics. They're undemocratic because they only benefit a certain group instead of all. I mean, truly democratic would be the policy should affect everyone equally. Giving special privileges goes against that fundamental concept. We're all equal. It's unjust because it forces someone to give up their rights, their freedoms, their income, their wealth, in order to advantage someone else. Where's the justice in that? You take away from one person to give to another one. That's not justice, especially if it's a coercive process. Now, democratic politics also create perverse incentives for political officials, in the sense that you see people as vote banks, and you need them to remain dependent on you so that they will vote for you. So it's inconvenient for the people to be more prosperous. If they become more prosperous, they don't need you. When you have these political rallies, they're at work. But poor people who are kept out of jobs come willingly to these rallies to get whatever might be given away for free. Now, inasmuch as democracy is only, if you strip away all the niceties, is only a voting rule, is having a vote better than having freedom? So the question is democracy, what is the value of democracy without liberalism? So, in People's Republic of North Korea, you can vote. But that's about it. The other things you can do is you can give unconditional support to the government, or you can perish. Those are your only choices. So, on the other side, Hong Kong had a much different experience as a colony than India. In Hong Kong, they had very few, they had no vote, but they had extensive economic and civic rights. So where would you rather be? In North Korea, where you could vote, or in Hong Kong, where you could prosper and not vote? So we need to separate these ideas, I think. Now, the thing is with liberalism is that it involves extensive freedoms, shared by all of us equally, not by one group because of some characteristic. But all groups are viewed as having been made up of individuals who have the same rights and freedoms. So, let's then look at what markets can deliver. Now, we all know what... now, neither of these are perfect. Now, there's no suggestion that democracy is perfectly imperfect, nor will there be a suggestion that markets are perfectly perfect. What we're trying to do is to see if we have problems, what is the first place we should look for a solution? Now, markets involve private choices. Nobody's obliged to make the choice. Markets are guided by self-interest. That is, the self-interest in this regard is, what is your life purpose? Does what you do help you fulfill what you want to achieve in your life? That sounds pretty, not just benign, that sounds pretty interesting. Now, this is the way to expand social welfare, in the sense that if we're all in pursuit simultaneously of our chosen life purposes and disallow from interfering with one another in achieving them, and engaging in social cooperation, this is going to give us the greatest social welfare. Because we're choosing to engage in these activities. Now, of course, we're obviously leaving out the very small minority of any population that is somehow incapacitated. Okay? And that's a special case, obviously, but for the most part, we will see that most of the people, most of the time, will benefit by having this expansive range of freedom of choice to pursue and also to identify what their life purpose is and to change it as they get new information. So, welfare decisions left in private hands tend to be much more democratic. So when governments decide on welfare, they say, well, you're a more reliable voter or voting bloc, will benefit you, or we need you. Whereas in the private sector, the welfare decisions are left in private hands in the sense that the life outcomes are decided by our social cooperation. Life outcomes, social welfare, are decided by our cooperation. All have a voice in this. You don't want to go. The first time I think in any country in the world I've ever seen a McDonald's close was at Green Park. And McDonald's is like this huge corporation with all the money in the world, but they couldn't make it in Green Park because people didn't want to eat there. I mean, this is really remarkable. It's a very interesting thing. So these private decisions indicate that this didn't satisfy what people wanted. I found that really interesting. So everybody had a voice. They'd rather go to Evergreen, not to McDonald's. Now, it tends to lead to increased national wealth. Now, this is evident from a number of international studies. The more economic freedom a country has, the more prosperous it is. This is across all countries, across time. So this is a conclusion that is readily supported by a great deal of data from places like the Economic Freedom of the World. Harvard is involved with a number of one of these international sort of studies on the relationship between economic freedom and prosperity. Now, again, it tends to reduce economic discrimination, as I mentioned before, because of the nature of the profit motive. Profit motive punishes you if you discriminate against your customers. Of course, I'm discriminated against quite a lot here by the auto drivers, by these people trying to extort money out of me for a variety of reasons. But, well, not just today. It's a common circumstance. But the thing is, it will backfire on them on repetitive purchases. Now, individuals, this is a critical thing to me about how markets operate in terms of the impact on individuals that I mentioned earlier. You discover how your efforts and talents will be valued by the community. What value are you to your fellow members of the community? And only in the market can you find that out. I mean, governments will give you money just because your income is low, or you're a woman, or you're adopted, or whatever it may be. But it won't be based upon what your value is to the community and what you're contributing to the community. This, again, is that sense of achievement that I mentioned earlier. Now, markets require secure, non-arbitrary property rights. Competition is a key element of markets. And where we see an absence of competition, you could always determine that there's a government policy behind whatever restrains competition. I used to give my students an offer. I would tell them, if you can give me an example of a monopoly that is of some consequence in the sense that it imposes costs on the community, that has survived over a long period of time without government intervention, I would give them an A and they can walk out of the class, never come back. Now, monopolies, which are, by literal definition, a single seller, only survive if governments protect them from competition. Because what will destroy a monopoly? Technology, changing relative prices. If it becomes whatever they're selling becomes too expensive, people shift over to something else. Mortality of the innovator. It hasn't happened to Apple yet, but it may well. We may see that losing Steve might have a bigger consequence. Okay? It's not that they were a monopoly by any means, but what we see is that the dynamics of the market will destroy monopoly. Monopoly is a construction of government policy. So, if we have competition, markets will work better. And many of our complaints about markets, if we strip things away, we'll find that there's some government policy underlying it. Either contracts are not being properly enforced, court laws aren't enforced, and so on. Now, one of the things that non-economists don't often understand is that governments cannot create jobs. Governments cannot and do not create wealth. Governments can give people jobs, but governments cannot create net additions to the workforce. So if I give him a job as the government. I have to tax him to pay for it, so he can't hire him. The money he would have used to hire him is going to him. There's no net gain in John. In fact, because I have very high carrying costs. I've got a chauffeur, I've got a nice office, I've got a car, I've got a pension, I've got very nice, I'm looked after well working for government. So I've got to tax him even more so maybe he doesn't get a job. So there's two losses to support one government job. So government hiring cannot and will not lead to net employment growth. So this is why in a place like Greece, the guy who might be running the next new government says, we don't want to lay off any more government employees. The only way Greece is going to get out of their problems is by cutting the public sector workforce. Because it's just too much of a burden on the head of the private sector. The private sector is carrying that kind of burden. Governments don't create wealth. Now what governments can do is create conditions for the private sector to create wealth. Now wealth in this sense is the productive capacity of the economy. So usually what we see, if governments produce things, they've got to tax someone to purchase the wealth. So much of what government does is a drain on wealth rather than an expansion of wealth. Think about New Delhi. The most valuable property perhaps in the world is in central Delhi. And who's sitting on it? Some government agency. Either it's my favorite one was a railway officers club in Hyderabad. This enormous palatial estate that only railway officers, not railway employees, just some of them can go there. These are better than the country club my father had in the U.S. Unbelievable places. You go to Delhi and you've got all these government ministries sitting on the most valuable. That's not adding to the wealth of this country. It's detracting from the capacity of this country to produce wealth. They should be put, especially the military forces. Now the British needed military forces in urban areas to keep down brown people. Right? Because they wanted to keep their colonialism on. But why do your military have to be in the middle of town? My other favorite example was and why is there a naval presence in Delhi? I haven't been able to find the naval force. But there's a naval officers club on the road to the airport. The road to the airport was held up for a couple of years because they didn't want to give up about 4 meters of the verge. The whole country was held back because of one government ministry, or one part of one government ministry of defense. They weren't going to give up that, 3 or 4 meters of land that ran in front of the officers club, naval officers club. Why they didn't? I mean, if I was running such if you're going to set conditions like that, we're shutting the whole thing down. And governments don't create wealth. They tend to be a drain on wealth creation. But good policies, like in a place like Singapore, can allow the private sector to find a way to create wealth that's shared by people. You look at a place like Singapore or Hong Kong, where you've got this government policies that promote wealth creation. Now, public policy is almost always about redistribution, because there's always a spending element and a taxation element to every public policy, whether it's education, whatever it may be. So this involves a redistribution of income and wealth, which requires force behind it. Now, public policy can affect market operations. One of the things that I learned, and you may or may not agree with, and I think most of you probably have a different view on this, because I did when I was young. Whenever many people see a problem, they say government spending can fix it. When I see a problem, I think government policy causes it. Persistent economic problems, like that are widespread, are almost always traceable to bad public policy, either a specific one or a broad one. Zimbabwe. It used to be a food exporter. It was a breadbasket of Southern Africa. It's a disaster. The economies collapsed. They had hyperinflation. Now, what caused that? Bad public policy. All of those problems can be traced to corruption, the attempt. Zimbabwe tried to educate its people instead of creating economic opportunities for them. So what would you rather have? A good job or good education and no job? What they got in Zimbabwe was a decent education, but what they did is that they consumed the seed corn for the future. That is, they consumed wealth in the process of trying to educate the people. And then, when they got educated, they said, where are the jobs? Where are the jobs? Because there's no wealth being created. So, good policies lead to good to prosperity. So, and that prosperity can only be delivered by the private sector. Only. Governments nowhere in the world can deliver wealth. They can create policies that allow wealth to be created, but they don't create wealth on their own. They usually consume it. So, as I mentioned, democracy is not an end in itself, only a means. Now, part of the understanding that I have about the political process is based upon these next assumptions. You may have to think about these a little bit. First of all, when I grew up, there was a presumption, and I think in this country, the high regard that the Indian civil service was held in. People, these were the smartest people that had to pass this rigorous exam. They would be superstars anywhere in the world. So we would look at these people in awe. It was the same thing in the United States. Public officials in the United States were trustworthy and competent. Now, but the reality is that the people that we often turn to fix problems that are our fault are just as stupid as we are, just as fallible as we are, just as self-interested as we are. I mean, they care about their families the way we do, and they'll do what they can to make life better for their families. They don't say, no, I'm going to sacrifice my family for the good of America or India. No, they're going to say, well, if I have to cut corners and help my family, I'll do it. They're also faced cognitive limits. They don't know anything more about the future than you or I. And they can't. In fact, they know less about what we know individually because they can't accumulate that data that would be needed for them to make a good decision. That data is, number one, not available, and therefore it's uncollectible. So they can't know what it is that's needed to fix the problems in many cases. They may have a suggestion of what will fix the problem, but very often we'll see that creates another unexpected problem. So we need to get away from viewing public sector officials as being some people better than we are. In fact, they are no different than we are. Now, politicians, one of the assumptions we make is that politicians, regardless of their declaration, I'm here to help the poor, I'm here to help you, I'm here to make India stronger and freer. What they're really motivated by, will you vote for me? Because no matter what they want to accomplish, they can't do it if they don't get enough votes. So ultimately it comes down to that. And that's why politicians around the world will tell people whatever it is they need to tell them to be elected. And then they don't fulfill those promises, thank goodness. So, the profit motive is often viewed as something unsavory about the market. But politicians have a similarly sort of sense of greed in trying to maximize votes. Now, within the political process, we've got the politicians and we also have voters, like you and me. Now, it turns out democracy is diluted by the fact that we as voters have very weak incentives to be informed about what it is government can do, what it is they are doing, what it is they should do, what they've done. Because, first of all, we're rational. We know that your single vote will have almost an infinitesimally small impact on the actual outcome of a large number of elections. Number two, we've just got other things to do. You've got your kids to worry about, you've got your exams to worry about, you've got car payments, you've got your mother's ill. You go home and you don't read the editorial page, you look at the sports. Or you look at the fashion. You don't sit there and studiously read about... some people do, but most voters don't. So this is what economists call rational ignorance. That we choose to be uninformed. Because being informed is costly. And I'd rather watch TV. It's just what happens. This dilutes the impact of the voter on the democratic process. But on the other side, we have what we call special interest groups. Now these are people who could benefit from a public policy or might be harmed by public policy, but they have very strong incentives to vote and to participate. Why? Because the impact on them of the political choices from an individual perspective is very large. Whereas the voters, the impact of the political process on them individually tends to be relatively small, because you're one of a billion people. But a special interest group, if you can get the government to give special privileges to your industry or to the sort of sector that you're most interested in, that'll have a big impact on your income. So you're going to donate money, get involved in politics. So what happens then, because these special interest groups have such a strong incentive to participate, and voters have such a weak incentive, special interest groups tend to dominate. Now this is what we call lobbyists sometimes. Okay? So, who writes the laws? Do you think the guys that are elected to the Lok Sabha, they write all those laws? Some of these guys that are charge sheeted from Bihar or wherever, you think they write those? No, the lobbyists write them. They pass on what they want, and then somebody in their staff interprets it, and they build it into a... Certainly this is the way it's done in the States. They produced a 2,000-page bill for the U.S. government to get more deeply involved in the healthcare sector. And all the people that voted for it said, well, I didn't read it. Didn't have time to. They were given a 48-hour review period. There's no way you could... Well, that means if they didn't read it, that means they didn't write it. Legislators very seldom write laws. Some do, some get involved with it, but for the most part it's done by these special interest groups that are saying, do this, put this in, and we will support your party or your campaign. This is the harsh reality. So small groups dominate the public policy decision-making process, even though it goes against the majority. How's that for democracy? And we're still voting. We've got to vote, right? But we as voters tend to be disorganized, rationally ignorant. In India, I don't know, what are the participation rates? They're pretty high for voting. But in a way, in some ways, it doesn't really matter whether it's a high or low participation. Because these groups dominate. So it's not just that people are too lazy to vote. It's that these guys have too strong an incentive that will dominate the policy outcome. Now let's look briefly at bureaucracy. This is another element. So we looked at politicians and voters being very important players in a democracy, and special interest groups, the lobbyists, but another important player, the babus. Okay? So, now, bureaucrats, firms maximize profits, politicians maximize votes, bureaucrats maximize the budget. So, think about bureaucracy. I want to have the most efficient bureaucracy to make India a better country. He wants to have the biggest bureaucracy so he can steal as much as possible. She wants to have a bigger bureaucracy to have more power and influence and be respected. Okay? Now, we can come up with any number of different motivations, but all of those motivations require a larger budget. The only way to do good things for India that you have in mind is have more money. Right? Now, and can you imagine how many ministries, when the budget is being formulated, they say, look, hang on, please, cut our budget next time. You know, we really want less. Right? How many do that? No. Oh, we couldn't possibly get by with less than 20% more. The whole country will shut down if we don't get whatever the ministry is. And we need more employees. And we need, and so on. So what happens is that the growth of government doesn't serve the people, it serves the public officials. Because they want this additional power, they want these additional resources, even though, what happened? It's a basic problem. So, anyway, I talked about it. Let me just end with the following remark. This is the punchline. Unlimited democracy is a much greater threat to social order than unlimited markets. Now that's a challenging statement. Now think about what unlimited democracy means. It means that there are no restraints on the expansion of the state to decide what's good for you. That is, some babu, some politicians are going to decide on your life outcome. They're going to put constraints and limits on it. Okay? So, unlimited democracy means that every aspect of your life could ultimately be put up to a vote. Now, what would unlimited markets be like? Unlimited. Now, we're never going to see one or the other, obviously. But let's just look at tendencies. If we're moving towards unlimited government, it means your life outcomes are increasingly politicized. Now, if that sounds appealing to you, you'll love Nazi Germany. Because that's the ultimate politicization of life. If you're a Jew, a gypsy, a homosexual, into the gas chamber. Right? And then all the other things that go with that. At war with the world. Okay. So unlimited democracy means increasing the politicization of life. Your life outcomes are up for grabs for other people. Now, unlimited markets, something I'm not saying that's where we're likely to head. But unlimited markets are defined by what? Expansive competition, expansive freedom, expansive choices, do what you want with your life, use your resources as you wish, fewer interferences with your choices. Other people don't decide what's good for you or what's good for other people. Now, it may take a certain mindset to see that, most of us want more choices most of the time. Now, I think what some of us don't like is other people making more choices. We'd like to see other people's choices constrained. But in a sense, my point in this discussion is as follows. Unlimited democracy is much more dangerous to public order, social harmony, an unlimited market. And that we need to place a much higher degree of, a much higher test before we look to government to solve these problems. In other words, government should be the last choice for solving a problem rather than the first choice. That is, let's see if voluntary arrangements can work. And in fact, what we find is that most of the times when we are disappointed with markets, it's not that markets couldn't deliver the results. There was something that stopped that process from working more completely. There were constraints on competition, on pricing. So if we look at something like the agricultural market in this country, or look at the rupee. Why is the rupee collapsing? Oh, it's because the market hates the rupee? No. You've got policy paralysis. You've got bad policies. You've got, growing deficits and debt. The government's refusing to reform or backpedaling on reform. They're imposing retroactive taxes. You've got problems in this country with trying to attract investment, and they're chasing investment away. So is the collapsing rupee a problem with the market? No, the market's just responding to bad news that keeps coming out of New Delhi. And they're punishing the country for it, unfortunately, rather than them. You're being held accountable for their mistakes, for their bad policy choices. So, anyway, I don't need this. So, I made some provocative statements, I hope, and I'll open the floor.
You said that democracy, we say democracy is majority. So this is a percentage. Let's say you ask how many people participate in India. So if I just give you a percentage, so almost 60 to 70% of is registered for voting. If you calculate all of that, that comes to 12% of the population.
A very small amount.
So I just want to put that number out for today for the majority.
It's not a majority of the population. It's not even a majority. It's not even a majority of the voting. Yeah, it's a small plurality of the voting population, and those are the ones that decide for the whole country. So it's a real interesting thought. Whereas, yes, ma'am.
Very interesting.
I don't hear well, so if I come close, don't be shy.
It's very interesting thought to me. And I was trying to figure it out that as I was learning specific very economics, talking about the groups of markets and all modes of the markets. And talk about the unlimited democracy and what is happening across the globe, like unrest, unemployment, and just by coming on the roads and all the revolution going on. How to correct that system? Like, can you come up with some of the arguments that talk about the state is unlimited democracy and correct our lives?
Yeah, I think in what we're seeing now with the unrest, especially in particular, it's more vivid in Europe at the moment, is an outcome of this momentum towards unlimited democracy. The European welfare state created an unbearable burden on the capacity of the private sector to deliver sufficient growth economically for the country to repay the debts that it had accumulated. So, for example, in Greece and in much of Europe, they kept hiring more and more public sector employees who, by the way, do not pay taxes. No government employee anywhere in the world pays taxes in a meaningful sense. They earn taxes. Whatever they pay back doesn't expand the pool of revenue. The pool of tax revenues only comes from the private sector. The people who work in the public sector take and then put back. So the pool doesn't change. And what happens, and what happened in Greece, is that the pool is shrinking relative to the obligations. That is, the capacity of the private sector to expand the revenue pool, stream of revenue, has been outstripped by the obligations imposed by the payments to civil servants, their pensions, and so on, and all the other government expenditures. Governments always say that they're investing in these activities. It's, for example, like the Right to Employment Act here. They claim that they're using those funds for investments. They're improving irrigation canals. They're doing all these. Now, show me the numbers. How many linear meters of irrigation have been built or improved? In fact, most government spending is not investment in a meaningful sense. It's consumption. In the end, most of the right to employment spending is really about consumption. It's just a transfer. And that's another problem with unlimited democracy, is that governments expand their spending not on investing in things that will make the economy more productive, but the things that are just consumed today. And that means, as I mentioned a moment ago, we use the expression we use in English in America. You're consuming the seed corn. Instead of planting the corn to grow the next, you're eating it all, and you go, whoops, we don't have enough to grow enough food. So this is what's happening. As democracy has expanded the obligations onto the taxpayer, there's fewer taxpayers and more people depending on it. So this is why Greece is at the state of collapse. And now people are going, why should we stop spending? But who's going to pay for it? The Greeks want the Germans to pay for it. They want to carry on with their excessive promises to people and the obligations they cannot possibly fulfill. They have to repay the money that they borrow, and they make obligations to their own people. But something's got to give. And I put it down to this sort of... And the more people that depend upon the public sector for income, the more demands there will be for the public sector to do more. Because the people that are actually paying the bill become the minority. In a country like India, that's true anyway. What proportion of people actually pay income taxes here? Very small. 10%? Most less developed countries, the people who actually are making up that big pool of tax revenues from which governments... But the reason they keep borrowing more is because they can't find enough revenue. Because the more you raise people's taxes, they either change what they were doing before, maybe they move their money offshore instead of investing it here. Or like the guy I mentioned, the guy from Facebook that left for Singapore. Just pack up and take everything. Let me see somebody else.
I'm looking for the solution.
Huh?
I'm looking for the solution.
Well, the solution is a retreat of the state.
Is it the extension of the markets?
Well, a retreat of the state by definition means it's not just the market per se. It's expansion of individual rights and freedom. Because as the state grows, it grows at the expense of the citizens. The state grows by taking more resources from you and more freedom from you. So more power means less freedom. More resources means less for you. So states grow at the expense of their citizens. So give the country back to the citizens. Give more control of the destiny of your country to the citizen, to the individual citizen, and less to the state. It's more democratic. That is, you leave it to the people, not to the representatives. Now it's up to the representatives. They make all the decisions, and they often make bad ones. Now, another problem with democratic, with public policies, if I am a minister and I oversee a public policy and it goes wrong, I'm reluctant to change it because I invested my political career in this policy. I won't admit that I made a mistake. I mean, how many times do you see ministers go, whoops, we messed up. We're causing these problems. We need to backtrack. And how many of you get fired? Now, this guy, J.P. Morgan, lost $2 billion. The guy that oversaw that investment, that particular department, he got sacked. I think more of them should have gotten sacked, but at least you can see that in the private sector, people actually lose their jobs when there are mistakes. Why? Because the company could go bankrupt. If a minister makes a mistake, or a babu, well, you just tax somebody more, borrow some more money. So, again, the incentives are there. Correcting of mistakes made in the public sector are much less likely to occur than correcting mistakes made using your own money in the private sector. When you're using other people's money and you make a mistake, wow. And if you can't be sacked. I mean, civil servants don't get sacked. You had one guy go to jail recently, but he got out. But not many of them go to jail. And they make serious mistakes. And those mistakes, now if J.P. Morgan shuts down, that affects the people that work for it. If the Minister of Defense makes a mistake, it affects all of India. So the impact of mistake in the public sector is much larger than mistakes made in the private sector. When McDonald's made a mistake to put its branch in Green Park, that mistake didn't cost many people. Right? But when governments make a mistake, usually public policies affect us all, and we have to pay the price for that. So I think power to the people, that's the solution. Give power back to citizens. And the way you empower citizens is to respect their rights as individuals, not as members of a group or a sect or whatever, but as individuals. One other question?
Cris will be around, actually. I think those are really good ending words. So once you just say about giving back to people and their rights. So Cris will be here. If you have specific questions, come up and ask him. And otherwise, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Cris.
Thank you.